What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Munthe-Kaas, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Munthe-Kaas, and we speak about learnings from urban planning, about space and environments that make authentic connections and relationships work. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page. Hello, Peter, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hello, Miriam.
I am curious to explore the topic of facilitating authentic relationships with you. And to kick it off, when did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I think it's something like 20 years ago. I think the first time I met the word facilitator was when I was an activist in a youth culture house in Copenhagen. And there was like this woman that was running it. And she introduced all of us to the art of making projects and facilitation as a separate skill set. Like this idea that you can hold space for other people to enable them to have better conversations was quite new for me then, and also really, really fascinating. And I became quite obsessed with becoming good at facilitating, and spent a lot of time on it then, and I have ever since.
Nice. And what are the key skills then that have crystallized for you over the past 20 years?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I feel that it's changed a lot for me. For some years, it was very much about having the right tools and like having the toolkit and being able to pick out the right tools for the work needing to be done, and putting together the right program and having the right structure. And then at some point, I completely abandoned that and was like, well, the structure never really fits anyway, so it's all about improvisation. And that's the most important thing, being able to improvise in the structure. And I feel in the later years, it's gone more and more into something about the depth of the space that we can create together, and how to create an environment that allows for deeper meetings. And that's still quite a mystery to me. Mm-hmm. I have some tricks. I don't exactly know what that means.
And there are two things I would like to unpack with you. One is when you speak about tools, what do I understand by that? And then what do I understand by environments?
So when I talk about tools, or this tool mindset that I used to focus very much on, it was like finding methodologies that would enable us to do this in interesting ways. So it was like, I was into de Bono for a while, and like the thinking hats, and that whole way of working with parallel thinking, that kind of stuff, and like open space methodology, and a little bit into the art of hosting and their methodologies, and like this idea of picking the right method for what we're doing. So this toolbox approach was quite important for me for a while. And it still feels like it's there. Like there's a back catalog of all of this cool stuff that we can do, but that doesn't feel like the core of it anymore for me.
And still, I think, so I can relate very much to your journey. And it feels almost as if we first need to pack this toolbox and get confident with the different ways of applying the methodologies until you can really leave it in your backpack, because you know that you have embodied it. And then you can become more nimble and just pick and choose, merge, and create your own toolkit, so to speak. And then you moved to creating the depth, or focusing on the depth within an environment. And I would be curious to explore this a little bit further, because I know that you have a background in urban planning, experimental urban planning. So the context of environment becomes an entire different connotation, at least in my mind. So maybe you can share a little bit about your experience from the urban planning part, maybe a previous life, and how this has shaped your understanding of the environment you're trying now to create.
Yeah, just to give a little bit of context for that, like I did a PhD here in Denmark from 2011 to 14. And I worked with experimental urban planning in the municipality of Copenhagen. And before that, I did a little bit of research, or I was a research assistant on a project that worked with physical spaces for how to create creative environments in businesses. So like this idea of having like particular rooms for innovation and how that works. We did some research on that. And yeah, if I start there, the basic conclusion of our research project back then was most of these creative rooms doesn't really work because there's most often there's not the cultural component for using these rooms that's not present in the businesses that create them. So you just have these rooms that look weird or are very colorful or doesn't have chairs or, I don't know, are shaped like fish tanks or whatever. But people still have very ordinary meetings in them because the physical space is not facilitated somehow. There's a part of me that from that experience has gone a little bit into the direction where I'm like, well, fuck the physical space then. That's not really important. The deep importance is how we're people together. But of course, the physical space also affords different experiences. That's very clear for me. It's very different to have a meeting in a forest than having a meeting in a standard office space.
Absolutely.
We can embody different things. We're inspired in different ways.
Yes, and I like how you phrased it, that the space needs to be facilitated, and still the space also facilitates something through its structure. And I'm thinking of an experience in my previous life where there were meetings hosted in the boardroom. And the boardroom was basically thick walls, huge chairs, no flexibility, one bigger chair on top of the huge table, and doors that were so difficult to open that they were basically literally not inviting anyone in. And I once tried to host a creative workshop with students in this boardroom, and we ended up sitting on the floor in a circle because just to break this atmosphere, because it killed every kind of creative conversation.
Yeah, like boardrooms are like representations of hierarchy, very often at least. So it also becomes very hard not to organize around hierarchy if you're sitting in that kind of room. It's my experience.
So how do you break then the atmosphere of a room? Or how do you create the more experiential or inviting atmosphere?
I think one of my central tricks that I enjoy these days is naming. Like, what is here? Okay, it seems that this room is doing something. What is it? Like, can we explore that together before we start going into the stuff that we're meant to do? And just like, what is it like to be here right now? Something seems to be happening already. And that's also what I'm pointing at when I talk about this creation of depth or finding depth together. But like, I often feel that something is missed if I'm at a meeting or at a workshop or a gathering and we step straight into the thing. And it's like we become too focused or too like obsessed even with the thing that is supposed to happen rather than something is already happening here.
Interesting. So shaped by expectations maybe, and what has happened in our individual lives before.
Yeah, and also just by the context that is there. Like, we are sitting in a boardroom, it is doing something to us, and if it's not named, well, then it will keep doing that to us. But when named, it's like what is subtext becomes text. And suddenly we become aware that, oh yeah, there is something going on and we are empowered to play in that space or change it somehow.
Fascinating. Yeah. It almost loses its power once it's named, and then you can play with it.
Yeah.
And how would this be different when we talk about urban spaces so that they're not surrounded by walls? How do they shape interactions and maybe also this feeling of depth? And how is it in the virtual space?
I'm not sure if there's, like, at an abstract level, a big difference between urban spaces and rooms. It's clear that some urban spaces afford different interactions than others. And there's like a lot of research on that from like Jan Gehl, for example, who talks about the human scale. You probably ran into at some point.
No,
No. Okay. Is the urban space scaled for human interactions? Like, how big are the distances? Can you see people? Can you see their faces when you are in a space with them? Does it afford that you stop? Because if you can't stop in an urban space, then it's very unlikely that it will enable conversations or serendipitous meetings. So there's a lot of talk about this. How can we scale the cities so it allows for human interaction? And our cities are very much not designed for humans. They're to a very large degree designed for cars and transportation. And you can see that in, like, when you look at old cities and like the old city centers, like everything seems to have this quality of closeness, that like things are smaller, the streets are smaller, the likelihood of meeting people is larger. There are central plazas and stuff where you, I was about to say naturally, but I guess it is culturally, meet up. But they afford these meetings, where most modern cities are built in a quite different way, with separation between functions. So firstly, you live somewhere else than the city usually, and the city is for work or for consumption, and there's a lot of transport, where the streets are mostly afford movement and fast movement. So stopping is can often be a challenge, for example. I heard another one of your podcasts where someone talked about doing an experiment in airports where they would just, or at a train station, where they would just,
Lily. Yeah,
where they would just walk slowly, and that created like panic, because that's not what the space is meant for. That's not what it affords somehow.
Yeah, and it links to a thought that I had when I heard you speaking, that it's all about the purpose. So what is the purpose of a space, and how can we design for it so that it facilitates this purpose? And thinking of older city centers, they also usually car-free.
They're what, sorry?
They're car-free. So they're pedestrian areas usually, so that the likelihood of meeting other human beings, other citizens, is higher.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I've done with experimental urban planning has been about like, how do we bring humans into the physical urban space to have conversations. And by conversation, I also mean conversation in a physical sense, like building stuff together. So material conversations about what can the city afford? How could the city be different so that we would use it more, or so it would suit our needs better? So concretely, going to a relatively unused urban space that is supposed to be developed into a park, and then talking about what could be here, but not only having the meeting about it, also actually building something. Being like, okay, some people seem to want a stage here. Would that be interesting? Let's see what happens if we build a stage. And like, will anyone use it? How will it be used? Will problems occur that we didn't see before? So this prototypical approach to the city has very much been my work.
And it almost sounds like anthropological, where you put in a stage and then you observe what might happen.
Yeah, I think like at the university it was called design anthropology.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of something you said earlier on about the creative rooms in organizations, and that just putting a creative room in an organization which doesn't have the culture wouldn't cut the mustard. Do you say that? Yeah.
Do now.
And I can imagine that the same is true for an urban space, right? So just having the space that is put there doesn't, if the citizens don't have maybe the curiosity to meet each other or the trust, because everyone is afraid of each other, then just having this beautifully designed space that might enable it doesn't do the job.
Yeah, and that's where good architecture often fails. It's like you can imagine a beautiful urban space that will really create interaction and it will look beautiful. And when it's sunny, everybody will sit there and just think it's lovely. And then when it's there in action, it's like, oh, this place feels really empty and it's actually uncomfortable being here because it's a little bit too big when there's no people there. So now it's more like an unsafe part of town. So like I've looked at a lot of prestige architecture projects and how they look in the drawings and the renders, and like that architects will always draw people into their renders of future urban spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So it will always, like on the pictures, it always looks like there's a lot of really happy people there, and there's always someone with a child carriage, and there's always someone biking, and there's always children playing. And it's like, but these people doesn't exist. And it very rarely looks at like that when the space is really there. So a lot of my work has been about challenging that idea that you can think the city and then just put it there. Like think an urban space and then just place it in the city and then it will work like that, which is the sort of general planning paradigm of our cities. That we can plan the city and we can plan it perfectly. And then when we put it there, it will be the best solution because we know it's the best solution because we measured everything. And it doesn't really work that way. It's like the cities are super messy and they're full of controversies and they're full of people, and people are super messy. So my approach is that we need to start doing something with the people out there. And as we start doing that, we also start building networks where people can see new futures together. They can imagine new things and new ways of being together. And that doesn't happen just because of a new, like 100,000 bricks being placed in the city in a particular form. It happens because people start getting to know each other and seeing each other and seeing the materialities and touching the materialities. And there's a whole dance around that I would call like mobilization. That like the city is mobilized to do something new.
It's fascinating how the moment we put human beings into our plans and the theory, it messes everything up because we have dynamics, we have culture, we have things we just cannot plan for. Just like for the facilitation or for the planning of gatherings with people, like a workshop of co-creation, where also I find this analogy or similarity striking actually when I hear you speaking about we're designing a program, a space, an environment, interactions, and then people come. And as you mentioned before, then your plan and your toolbox don't work out anyway because suddenly something is there that wasn't there before. So how do you translate this huge amount of expertise into the work that you're doing today? And maybe you can share a little bit about the work you're doing today.
I think what has happened to me in my academic work is that I started being really curious about, democracy was actually where I started from. Being really curious about what is democracy, how can we create democratic processes. And then I got really curious about the physical space in the city and participatory democracy and how to include citizens in the creation of the physical space. And from there, I realized, well, the organizations that manage physical space, usually the municipalities, the public organizations, are super important. And how they are organized and what they can imagine doing in the city is super important for what becomes possible in physical space and what becomes possible for the citizens. So I started working with that, like the whole organizational aspect. And then from there, I realized that, oh, wow, well, there's people in these organizations. And those people have ideas about what their job is. And they have identities that are connected to their jobs being in particular ways. And they have fears around doing stuff wrong when they work in these organizations. And that is super important to work with, to enable them to be in their organizations in a way so that physical space can and the future of cities can look differently. So that movement has drawn me more and more into like, okay, so what is it like to be a human in relation with other humans? And what does that mean? And that is sort of where I am now. What is relating?
Beautiful. And how do you facilitate that? Because all these fears, all these doubts, all these preconceptions, they're all coming together. And then it's basically your role to shape that and to create the sense of relating, authentic relating.
Yeah, so well, I mentioned the one trick before, which is naming. It's like what is here. That also works in most relating settings, and especially if I'm the one that brings what is here for me, which is my vulnerability and my like, oh yeah, I don't really know what to do in this situation where I'm supposed to lead this meeting for you. It seems that there's a lot going on and I don't have the answers. So I would really like to get your help in trying to figure out what is the best way of doing this right now. Like, where are you coming from? Would be an approach I often go into. So naming what is there for me, and in that way inviting what is there for everyone else.
And how do you go about the risk that by showing your vulnerability and saying, okay, I don't know what's going on and what will happen, that a sense of authority or guidance, which also, I think as a facilitator, when you come in, people find safety in this kind of structure, trusting that you're there to hold the space, basically. Do you see a risk there to break this trust by showing too much vulnerability?
I think there's a risk if I would drop my leadership, but I don't see vulnerability as in opposition to leadership. I see it as a deeper leadership. So it's like saying that I'm not sure what will happen here, or that I don't really know what the best thing to do is not saying that I don't have a plan or an idea of how we could go ahead.
Thank you for making this distinction. Yeah.
So it's like the leadership is still there. All my capacity is still there. And then there's a surrender to the context that there's also already something happening here that I'm not in control of, because we're in it together. And like a trusting in that collective intelligence process. Yeah.
So it's basically pointing out that you don't have all the answers, but you do have the tools for the process and the guidance.
Yeah, I might. I have some tools, at least.
Yeah, as a that's a facilitating process. In your experience,
but I find myself more and more often when I have a consultancy firm where I do different kinds of jobs for organizations and municipalities. And I find myself more and more often in the role where my biggest contribution is saying, I don't really understand what's going on now. It's like, there seems to be some kind of plan here and you want to do something, and I don't really understand it. It's like, what is it you want to achieve? It's like, you all seem to agree that this is a good idea, but I don't get it. And there's just something in this, someone in the space admitting that they are not in control and they don't know what's going on, just seems to be such a gift. at least in Danish municipalities, where everybody really wants to know what they're doing and do good all the time. That seems to be a really big limitation, and it seems to lead to some bad decision making and some really bad urban planning in my experience.
Yeah, and not only urban planning, but
but it's everywhere. But that's my context.
Yeah, it seems as if the role is then to provide enough provocation and to mirror what is there in the room, where the group might not have the courage to admit it, because it feels almost sounds as if it feels so comfortable to just indulge in the illusion of agreement and shying away to really dig into the details, which might then reveal actually either we don't know what we're agreeing on, or we don't want to discuss the details that we're actually not agreeing on.
Yeah, and I think it's quite a big challenge in many organizations that I meet. I've been quite inspired by reading Robert Keegan, you know. It talks about he writes about adult development theory and how that plays into issues organizations have. And just a brief point is that he talks about the movement from what he calls the socialized self to the autonomous self. That's not his words, but it's something like that. And how that movement is what most adults in Western society is in right now. There's a part of us that is socialized, sort of always looking to the group or the structure for answers. And then there's a movement into a deeper autonomy, where it's like, what is my truth in the situation? And the way that manifests in many organizations, or at least one thing that I find interesting, is that you will see employees in many organizations that are so oriented towards what their manager or boss wants, or what they think that the boss wants, that they will do less work, or like the work that they will do, it will be less focused on really solving the problem and more focused on trying to make the boss happy. And I see that all around me. Like, there's these employees that are so oriented towards the hierarchy that they're not really doing their job, or at least they're not doing it to the full extent of how they could do their job.
And why is that?
Well, if you go into adult development theory, you say, well, that's because they have a very strong identity built around the feeling of being safe in the group, and being safe in the structure and doing the right thing in accordance with what the group thinks.
And thereby not daring to take their own stance, or contradicting, challenging.
The opportunity is to step into leadership, into self-leadership.
As a facilitator, do you ever find yourself stuck in a rut using the same activities over and over again? Or do you find yourself without a plan B, even though we know that things never go according to plan? That's why we made facilitator cards. I'm Meg Bolger. I'm a professional facilitation geek and the CEO of Facilitator Cards. Facilitator cards are the helpful nudge you need to get more creative in your workshops. They're a pocket-sized tool that you can use offline to create agendas and backup plans for your virtual and in-person facilitations. And for Workshops Work listeners, you can get a free set of wet erase markers to use with your facilitator cards by using the code WORKSHOPSWORK at facilitator.cards. That's facilitator.cards, and enter WORKSHOPS WORK at checkout.
And is this a individual work or a group work? So is it a development or a cultural change that you can facilitate, or is it rather a coaching or an inner journey, personal development kind of thing?
That could be both. It's like it is something that is happening to everyone. Like, everyone is in a process of development through their whole life, so it is already happening. And then there's various methods for working with that yourself, or to facilitate it for groups. And for me, again, this naming of what is here, what is the different truths that we are holding, doing that in group settings can be a really strong tool to play into that field.
Can you share an example of what it triggered in a group once you opened this maybe Pandora box, because I can imagine that it's a scary moment for a facilitator to name or to invite the group to name, and then also to do the first step, to go first and name what's there for them.
I think something that I often experience happening in that kind of settings is that someone feels unsafe, and that is brought in as part of the context. That I'm not safe here. I don't feel safe in my fullness, or I don't feel welcome in this space. And then having that as like, oh wow, yeah, how can we bring you in then? Like, what is it that you want to bring that doesn't feel like it's welcome? So it can create a lot of positive energy. It can also become okay, but what is this not feeling safe? Are there more people here that doesn't feel safe? Is this maybe part of the general dynamic in this organization or in this space that a lot of us doesn't feel safe to speak? And what is that about? And then, of course, it depends on what you want to happen at your meeting. This would be a group process kind of conversation. If we're trying to, set business goals for the next season, maybe this is not what we are supposed to do right now. So there's also like a choice of when do we want to process our context and when do we want to do the work. And that balancing act can be quite interesting.
Yes, and I would like to hear more about that, how you're actually, what is your thinking or sensing process that would then guide you to either go deeper or not? Because two things. One is, I sense that if someone dares to speak up and say that they don't feel safe, it kind of implies that there is at least a minimum amount of safety, or at least they trust you as a guide and facilitator enough to feel safe enough to voice that. So is it a paradox or is it kind of normal? And from there, can we actually, is there a chance of achieving the initial set purpose or goal of the meeting after something like that has been said?
I can start with the last bit because I find that challenging. And like in the organizations and groups I am in right now, all of us are quite interested in this introspection and group introspection. And we have a tendency of like never really getting anything done because we always go for the process. It's like, ooh, something is happening. Let's be with that a lot. And now we're starting to sort of work our way back to, okay, how do we name that it's in the room? There's like, okay, we can see that you're really sad now and that you're in a deep process, and we still need to make our business plan or plan the program for the next month. Or that needs to be done during this meeting. And that can be one way of going ahead, like naming what is in the room and then still moving into the work. The first part of your question, I think for me, points to another word that's important for me, and that's the invitation, like how to invite into anything. And for me, that is a core facilitation skill. What is invited into the room? And something I've also worked a lot with in this urban planning context. There's like an invitation implies that there is direction, there's convergence, but also that there's a certain level of openness for your creativity and for you to step in and co-create with me. So like the invitation is not putting something on you. It's more like creating a vacuum where you can move into or like step towards me. I remember I heard a talk by someone mentioning that the way you teach a baby to swim is not like pushing them forward in the water in front of you. It's like you put them in the water in front of you and then you slowly move backwards and they will naturally swim towards you. And I like that image for the invitation. And the best way of inviting for me is doing it by example. Like what the stuff I would like to see in a space, I need to bring myself. Because how can I expect anyone else to bring the stuff I want? So that's like my leadership and my self-leadership. Like, oh, there seems to be something, and that can be embodied. It's like something seems to feel constrictive in this space that I'm supposed to lead right now. And the best way for me of moving forward from there is naming it. But like something feels really constrictive. And then it's like very, very often I'm about to say almost always, there is some resonance in the room. That like the thing that I'm feeling in my body is not just about me, but it is something that is present for us. And it's not like I can figure out what it is. It's not like I feel constricted in my body and that's because the boss of this group of people is really oppressive, or like that would be taking it way too far and making it too much in the mind. But this like embodied sense that there's something here, and then naming it, that opens an invitation for others to bring their embodied experiences in.
And I just wondered whether it could even work the other way around. I was thinking of a situation where, as a facilitator, you actually sense that it's a happy-glory, free group. So you sense that there's openness, that there's respect and curiosity. And then, okay, let me circle that back, because where I'm coming from is very often as facilitators, we want to show that vulnerability is allowed by making ourselves vulnerable. But then if we don't feel any of that vulnerability, then we cannot fake it. But I can imagine, and I would be curious of your perspective, that even if we genuinely show that, oh, I can sense that this is a very open, creative group that can communicate freely, then to invite to also contradict that. And I wonder whether it's possible.
I had an experience with that quite recently where I was invited out to facilitate a practice called circling for a network of business consultants. And they were like curious about this practice. And they had been doing all sorts of stuff together for years, like breath work and all kinds of a weird workshop-y thing that they thought would be interesting for them, like all the strange retreats and stuff. And I started these like with some exercises with them, and it really felt like, wow, you're a really coherent, loving group of people that have just been with each other for years, and you know each other really well, and you trust each other a lot. And I was like, wow, I just feel like bathed in love, and it's beautiful to be here with you. And then we moved a bit on into another form of the practice, and it was like suddenly there was still like this, okay, there are some edges here. Like, whereas like just given space, it's like these edges still come up and shows themselves. Then it became quite uncomfortable for the group to be there, because they suddenly saw that there was like, what is all this stuff that is suddenly happening? There's like conflicts and issues that have not been seen before in this way. So I think there are ways of opening groups to that by simply being with what is, like, again, sitting with it for a while. The question, what is happening right now, is always good. If, of course, this is still like group process work. It's not we're trying to get shit done. More like, what is here? What is it like to be us in this room? Like, that is the core question of circling, which is a practice I spend a lot of time on now. What is it like to be here? And just staying with that in a kind of relational meditation. And then what came to me when you asked about this group of all happy people that were just like, for me, I think the vulnerability for me in such a situation would be like, am I needed as a facilitator? Like, why am I here? You seem to be able to do all the stuff that you need to do on your own. And like, what is my contribution here? And then sharing that could be an interesting opening into something new.
I like that. I really like that approach. Also, because it sounds as if it would invite permission to the facilitator to then also put boundaries on the space. Because what I've experienced with these kind of happy glory groups, that they're very bad in following a process and taking decisions, because they're just enjoying each other's company and each other's ideas and contributions so much that they would go to all the different places. And then it can feel, I think, for a facilitator, for myself, I always feel bad that I then have to constantly interrupt them and say, yeah, all great what you have to discuss, and I love your jokes, but now let's come back to the topic. So by stating that, and as you said, the vulnerability of, okay, do you actually need me? Making them aware that, yes, that's the downside of this happiness, and thereby speaking out and naming the permission to interrupt the happiness.
Yeah. And I think I want to emphasize that for me, this was a thought example. I'm not sure if that would really happen if I was in a room with such a group. And I wouldn't say that if that wasn't happening to me.
Yeah.
It's not a trick. It's not a manipulation of the space. It is just naming what is happening to me in the context I'm in. Because otherwise, I think it probably doesn't work, or you will get resistance from the group if you.
Yes, I think it would totally break the system. First of all, because we usually sense if someone is not authentic. There's something where apparently our visual expression, our body language, and our words don't match, and human beings have a very good sense to get that. And then, if we expect authenticity and openness, need to show that. Yeah. From your perspective, what makes a workshop fail?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard for me to answer. I've been at a lot of workshops where I felt like this workshop kind of failed, or we didn't really get anything done, or like we landed on like a flat, we didn't really get anywhere. I think in business contexts, like context where we try to get shit done or like move something forward, my sense is that too much process and overemphasis on process and tools and methods make a lot of workshops fail. I've been at so many workshops where I spend a lot of time on doing a lot of exciting stuff, and there's a little bit of open space, and we have this process, and everything becomes a little bit rushed because we have to get on to the next one. And we produce a lot of cool posters, and we have a little performance piece that we practice and then perform for each other, and that's fun, and there is some development in it. And then at the end, we have half an hour to figure out what are we going to use all of this for. And it's like, it just sort of fizzles away. And I was like, because we have to go to work tomorrow again. And this was really the 8 hours that we had together to really get something done or get to some new understanding. And it feels like, well, this was fun, but and I think for me, my process has been, as I said, moving from this very toolbox-oriented way of doing stuff with very tightly facilitated program to more and more just giving space for what's important. What is really important here? Okay, can we focus on that and work that thing through in the time we have together? When the context is that I'm in an organization or in a business.
Which then implies, if I understand it correctly, that as a facilitator in charge of the overall process, you must be very clear and aligned what the final goal is. Because to give time to this emergence and to the storming, grounding, processing, agreeing, if you don't know where you're sailing to, then very quickly you can get lost in the waters. And then it becomes a pure introspection.
Yeah, I think for me that connects to the approach I have to change making in general, which I have framed a navigational approach. I've written a few articles about this, that this has been like the core of my academic work. About like how to navigate as a core skill in developing cities, but it also works in organizations. And for me, what I've tried to describe is that there are three interconnected elements in this. One is sensitivity. Like before I can do anything with an urban space or an organization, I need to be really sensitive towards what is already there. If I try to change something without having a good understanding of what is there, I will most likely fail. So I try to force something new into a space that I don't understand. So it most likely won't match. So the sensitivity is super, super important. And of course, that will keep developing the more I work with a group or a space or whatever. Then there's an aspect of the staging. Can we stage experiments where we try out something new, where we imagine something new together based on this sensitivity? Like, what are the possibilities? What is the potentiality of this space or our organization? And that is often like a workshop setting of some kind. It can also be like we meet in the city and we build something, but that is also a workshop in some sense. So the staging is like where the workshops belong. And the workshops serve to both create more sensitivity, that we learn more about what is going on, but they also serve or point to the third bit, which is mobilization, which is creating the new network. So what we do in change-making processes is that we look at a network, we become really sensitive towards what are the connections in the network. And then we stage to pull them apart a little bit. So like these things that seem to be really interconnected, maybe they don't have to be, maybe it can look differently. And then we mobilize something new, like a new network that can exist in reality, not in our imaginations. And that's the important bit, that we stay with our sensitivity towards the possible while allowing the new to also step in. Henri Lefebvre talks about it as experimental utopia. so that you don't just imagine a utopia that is not here and then you work towards it. That will lead to disaster, and we've seen that many times in history. But what you can do is that you can experiment and open up reality for something new, and then see, can we impose something new in the reality that is really there in our organization now, in a concrete way that we can imagine doing this. Okay, but what happens if we prototype that right now? Okay, that didn't work as expected, but it did something. And then we start mobilizing around it. It's like, and then what was previously impossible becomes real. And that move for me is one of the most fascinating things in the world, and also what I call magic to a certain extent. It's like something that was not real before is suddenly real. That's amazing.
Beautiful. Thank you for this example. And it almost feels like also including parts of this design thinking process where you prototype, you first understand and empathize, you prototype. And then since it's a co-creative process, those who were involved in the process also get attached to it and then are more engaged or more willing to see it manifesting.
They're transformed by the process.
Yeah.
Or tamed even.
Do you have a favorite exercise, so to speak, that you like to do with groups when you work with them in such a process?
I have a collection of favorite exercises. It's like, I told you about some of the moves, and like I think that is probably what I go back to. If I would name one exercise concretely, it would be something called the curiosity game. Do we have time to play for like 5-6 minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is a game about curiosity, and we can play it right now. So the game goes like this, that I will have, let's say, 2 to 3 minutes now to ask you questions that I am curious about. And the only rule is that I have to be really curious about the questions I ask. You don't have to answer if it feels too personal or you just don't want to. So the only rule is that it is about my curiosity of you. Okay? So are you ready?
Yes.
Why is this work with workshops work and never done before really important to you?
It almost feels like an inner drive, an inner calling. And I get tremendous energy from bringing people together to co-create something that wasn't there before. I cannot explain it rationally.
How is that for you to like have this thing that you really do a lot that is not rational?
For a usually very rational person like me, it's sometimes discomforting. And I think over the past year, since the last Never Done Before, I learned and grew in embracing that and feeling more comfortable with it, trusting that good things will happen.
What is your biggest insecurity about the project?
Letting people down, creating expectations that I cannot meet, and then admitting that their expectations is not my responsibility.
So I asked you about why is this work really important for you? What is really important for you at a personal level? Like when you're not at work, when you're not doing this project.
It's interesting, it kind of merged. It is deeply personal. And maybe, so I'm an introvert. I don't enjoy groups a lot. I was never part of a clique. So maybe creating this community and the sense of belonging fills maybe something that I cannot find otherwise. So it makes me happy to see it happening for others. And find belonging and meaning in that.
So the next step in the game is that you now have 1 minute to give me feedback on the questions I asked. So how did you experience the questions? Did you like them? And are there maybe other questions that would have been more interesting for you to have been asked? So I'd like about 1 minute for that.
I was surprised how openly I answered your questions. And this has nothing to do with me being so open, but with the way how you asked the questions. So I think that the way you phrased, especially the first question, I could really sense your deep curiosity, especially because I saw how before asking the first question, you closed your eyes and you first arrived in your body and to sense your real curiosity. And I think something that I could then sense and felt totally free and somehow secure to just answer in whatever ways came to my mind. So thank you for that.
So I can feel your facilitation skills coming in now, because you kind of did an evaluation of the exercise. And what I was really asking for was, how did you like the questions? How was it like to be asked these things?
I felt seen. I liked the question because they were giving me an opportunity to express myself and to be seen. Would I have had thought of any better question? No, because they felt authentic and real.
So the twist of this exercise is that we get feedback so we can ask better questions. Mm-hmm. That's why we ask for feedback, and that's what partly this exercise teaches us. So based on your feedback, I now have a few more minutes to ask you questions. And that's like the gimmick of the game. And yeah, what I'm curious of based on your feedback is like something in you seemed to be touched. Do you know what that is?
And we're not on a meta level now. We're back in the exercise. I'm such a facilitator. I think it's generally I'm back on the meta level. That's how my brain functions, right? I cannot help it. But this is really me, so I cannot fake it. I think the opportunity to be asked a question with curiosity and then have time to answer just touches, and I would say us as human beings, because we don't get the opportunity very often.
That makes me curious if you feel like there is space for you in your life. Like, do you get the space that you long for, the people around you?
Yes. I think I learned to grow this space, and maybe I'm facilitating it a little bit too much, but that's my comfort zone.
So the way to end this game is that the one asking the questions, which is me in this case, gets to end 3 sentences. Sentence stems. The first one is my first impression of you was in a call with Jacques, the party scientist, where I felt challenged by you And I don't remember what I said, but there was some kind of conflict energy in me. There was something that got a little bit scared or wanted to move away. And then also a curiosity to like, what is this? Like also, there was also like an element of someone is willing to meet me in this challenge. That was interesting. And the second sentence then is the time I felt you the most in our little game now. The time I felt you the most was when you talked into your personal drive for doing the stuff you do, and this part about really being quite introverted and never really having the group, and now having somehow created the group that you want, or created a community that, the way I heard it, is like a community that where you also feel safe and where you feel part of, and that touched me, and it resonates a lot in me. I can see myself, how I have myself done that also. So I felt a lot of resonance in that. And the third sentence to end is one thing I really think I understand about you. It's of course a little bit more tricky or edgy. And I think what I understand is that there is a really deep longing to have community and to be part of. And like, yeah, be part of, I think, seems to be of really big importance, and also maybe quite vulnerable. So that's the curiosity game.
Thank you. Thank you for guiding me and the audience through this highly vulnerable exercise.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a good example of a lot of the work me and other people do in this relating sphere. And it's like a 5-7 minute game, and it always, for me, lands me in a space with someone that is like, wow, there you are. It's like, and I just love that experience of a situation with a person shifting into like this wow in me, where it's like, wow, you're another human being, and you have all your stuff, and you're unique and beautiful, and like that wow is very much what I live for these days. It feels like meeting God in another person.
And I can totally feel the magic of this exercise that just gets you right to the core of it, of finding, that was the topic of our conversation, right? This authentic relating with each other through vulnerability, through curiosity, and through depth. Would you then switch roles immediately?
Yeah, usually. I facilitate in different ways. If it's with a bigger group, I would usually have the one who has been asking the questions close their eyes and stay on the floor or on the chair, and the other person standing up and finding someone in the room that they feel really curious about. Because there's something nice with sitting there with closed eyes, and then when you open them, someone is sitting there in front of you and they're really curious about you.
I love that.
And it's not my game. It's in the larger authentic relating games curriculum. So it's one of the classics.
Thank you for sharing that. And all the rest of it. Is there anything that you would have wanted to share that we haven't touched upon in our conversation?
I feel a bit surprised with the stuff we have touched upon, but in a really good way. I feel like I've been in some nice corners of my existence, and of the stuff that's important to me. I would like to mention one thing that is very much on my mind right now, because we've worked on starting this Center for Relational Practices in Copenhagen, and just this week, a metaphor has been really strong in me. And it's a metaphor of Chinese medicine and Chinese doctors. I've practiced Tai Chi for many years, so this is like in my heart. But like in traditional Chinese medicine, you would pay your doctor when you're not sick, because obviously that's when they're doing their job right. And you would go to the doctor to stay not sick. And this just feels like something I'm missing in Denmark and in Western society. That's like, where are the services to keep us healthy and happy in our lives. And what we're working on in this center now has been like this subscription service on our events. And this week I was just like, what I really want to do is to make like a subscription on a healthy body and mind. So it's like you can come here as much as you want every month and just get back to your senses. Get a little bit of body therapy every month. Go to some workshops where you really meet people every month and you get out of yourself. I was just like, wow, that seems really powerful. And that is something I really want to provide in the world. Because in my experience, when I'm the least happy, I'm also the most occupied with myself. Like there seems to be a direct correlation between being really self-absorbed and like into my issues and being super special. And then what usually gets me out of it is meeting, for example, a group of other people where it's like, oh yeah, you're also human beings and you also have all of these struggles that I have. I'm not super special. I am in some ways, but I'm also really not. And we're kind of into this human condition together. And somehow providing that as a service. And since we can't have it as a public health service, then it will be private service. Yeah, that feels really important for me right now.
It's a beautiful vision. And I can totally see that. And I guess it's a human defense mechanism to be caught up in our own minds when we don't feel well. But then, yeah, the medicine is this authentic human connection, is the safe space to nurture that. How could the audience support you with your mission or the community?
Well, if you're ever in Copenhagen, you can come visit us. That would be fun. And then I guess by getting excited about relating, and like there's a lot of relationship nerds out there that you can contact, probably also where you live, and just seeing if there's really a particular magic in this deep listening to the other humans around us and connecting in that way. And I think our world really needs that. It's like, I don't think we will get we won't get out of all the problems we're in today with trying to fix them from the same mindset that we've fixed everything else, all the stuff that we have now from. We need deep sensitivity of what is there, and that requires us to listen more to each other and what's around us. And I think if more of us own that skill, then there's more hope.
Mm-hmm. And it almost feels like a full circle back to what you said in the beginning when you referred as your journey as a facilitator, that it's not about the tools, but about the sensing and the relating and the depth. And this applied not to group work or urban planning, but actually to our personal journeys and how we relate to others. That it's not about the process, not about the goals and the milestones, but the sensing. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
And I put the links on how to find you and your community in the show notes, so everyone listening that can find you and relate more. Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.